Great, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for being here. I see some familiar faces and some new friends in the audience. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your day to hear a panel discussion on the mitochondrial era. And before I have my colleagues here introduce themselves, this is really a panel about longevity, which has been a theme throughout the last few days for those of you who've enjoyed the more biotech and pharma healthcare oriented panels and discussions, but really one from the drug developers' perspective. The entrepreneurial drug developers who I have the privilege of sharing the stage with really have to think about longevity from a very scientific standpoint, but also a risk-adjusted tactical standpoint. And that's what we'll be discussing today. So please, I could certainly spend probably the entire half hour discussing each of your CVs, but maybe I'll turn it over to you to highlight your background and how you've engaged in mitochondrial and longevity research in your careers in the past. Please, Reenie, beginning with you.
Yeah, my name is Reenie McCarthy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Stealth BioTherapeutics. We are developing mitochondrial targeted therapeutics to treat diseases of aging. We have pretty interesting data in dry age-related macular degeneration, which gives us good clues about how to proceed in other diseases of aging in terms of when to intervene, how to identify biomarkers that are going to help us design trials, and really how to get to commercialization in diseases of aging. I think the question that we hope to discuss today is how do we move beyond the specific disease state to aging itself.
And Li Ping, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. And it's very nice to be here and has been a privilege. My name is Li Ping Lu, the founder and the CEO of HighTide Therapeutics. HighTide Therapeutics is a globally integrated biopharmaceutical company with operations in China, Hong Kong, and the United States. And we are focusing on the discovery and development of multifunctional therapeutics for the treatment of metabolic disease and the GI disorders. And really, grateful to be at this meeting. We're talking about the era of longevity, where to go, how to do it, and then present a more holistic approach. And we are having the clinical programs in worldwide on NASH, which is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, together with the Alzheimer's disease, maybe one of the major prevalent diseases. Right now, there's no unmet medical need. There's no approved drug, so it's a huge unmet medical need, and also for diabetes as well. And we've been doing research and also development for the past 12 years. And for a biotech company to be able to stay alive for 12 years, that's very challenging. And I was able to raise sufficient money to keep the company going, and I'm very excited to be here.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, not an easy feat, particularly over that time span, over a sector that is very susceptible to cyclical markets. My name is Rahul Kakkar. It's a privilege to be moderating this session. I'm a cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School in Boston. I'm a partner at Polaris Partners, which is a venture capital group in Boston. And I'm the CEO of Tome Biosciences, which is also a startup biotech, only 2 years old, however, in the Boston area, focused on genome rewriting for novel cell and gene therapies. So it's a privilege to be here with you. Before we get into the details of how we actually develop drugs, focusing on cellular health, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about mitochondrial biology, the powerhouse of the cell, let's take a step back and talk about longevity from a slightly different perspective. As I mentioned before, I think we've all heard talks on longevity over the last couple of days, and they've been really focused on different aspects of the implications for society, the economic implications of extending life. But as drug developers, how do you define longevity? Because how we as entrepreneurs define a disease area or biology influences the entire course of the company. How we identify biologic targets, how we design trials, how we interact with regulators, and eventually how we commercialize. So please, Reenie, starting with you, how do you think about defining longevity?
So for me, longevity, it's more health span is a little bit more relevant to me than longevity, full stop. And if you think about it, aging begins in our 30s, right? So diseases related to aging, and in our society, we tend to think of them as discrete diseases. Many of them are interrelated. It's part of the aging process, and it starts in our 30s. So ideally, I think we'd like to get to a place where we can identify people at highest risk of those diseases early and intervene early when there's a chance not just to stop, an acute event that happens at the end of a lifespan with these diseases, but interrupt the course of chronic disease and hopefully restore health span. I don't think we're there yet, but that would be my goal for longevity resource, full stop.
Outstanding, outstanding. And Liping, how do you think about longevity?
Yeah, if you really think of the definition of longevity, and I want to give you some number that would be very interesting to see. Back into about 40, 50 years ago, the average lifespan, for instance, using China for instance, it's about 50 years old. Now, after several decades, the average lifespan is about 70, 80 years old. If you really look at the number, that's about a 60%, extend the patient life and the population life. That's longevity. So I think if we can extend the population life another 60% at the base of the 80 years old, we're talking about people living 120, 130 years old. And now we need to look what did we do right in the past. We'll be able to extend the patient, the population average lifespan and from 50 to 80 years old. And then, that's where we should focus. But as you said, the longevity is, how do you define it? You need to define the right problem in order to find the solution. That's the way I look at it. Yeah.
Reenie, I think your point is incredibly interesting because we can almost think about dichotomizing longevity. In one bucket is sort of the privilege of the healthy. You don't have a chronic disease, maybe you're in your 30s, and you really think about almost in a way preventing disease, but not from a lifestyle standpoint, from a pharmaceutical standpoint. The other bucket is really more about living with the disease, and rather than the current spate of medicine, small molecules, large molecules, which tend to, at best, change the natural history trajectory, how do we actually reverse those diseases? So really focusing on the first bucket, because if we're talking about the mitochondrial era, we're talking about cellular health, we're really talking about that aspect of longevity. How do you begin to think about identifying biology and then translating that into human clinical trials, which is very different, to Liping, to your point, than the way we've thought about drug development historically?
Yeah, and exactly. So I think for clinical trials right now, we have to interrupt at a period when the trajectory of the disease is fast enough that you can see a divergence with a treatment in a matter of 12 to 24 months, because patients won't enroll in clinical trials for longer than that. So that drives us towards later stage, more rapidly progressing disease. I think that with some of the AI tools that we're seeing, and frankly, when we get into quantum computing, it's going to be even better when you're talking cellular health, because many cellular mechanisms are so intertwined that the one drug, one target approach is not right, probably. But I think with AI, we can actually start to see disease onset earlier. We're able to identify early biomarkers of disease. And with that, I think we're also able to start to identify which patients, even at those earlier stages, might be progressing more rapidly. So just from a clinical trial design perspective, it makes actually executing and operationalizing a trial that you have a chance of winning on better at an earlier point in time when, again, you might interrupt the trajectory of the chronic disease, save world healthcare costs, and everything else.
What an important point, because if we think about, in some ways, the failure of multi-scale data so far, and what I mean by that is we decoded the genome decades ago. This whole idea of metabolomic, proteomic, transcriptomic data, that exists in the public domain in many cases, yet the insights gleaned from that vast amount of data is paltry compared to the size of that data. So clearly we need new research, we need new tools to almost in a hypothesis agnostic way dive in and understand the interrelationships between cellular processes that then allow us to identify where to intervene. And I do agree with you that with the computing tools and analytic tools we have today, we're not achieving those insights. I think there is the hope that AI will allow us to see connections that is not letting us do.
Exactly.
Liping, how about you? Tell me a little bit about how you think about identifying where to go in longevity-based research.
Right. I think if you just resonate with you to just talk about, the human tends to develop the dogmatic view. We think we are right all the time. but it's really with the integration of the AI, and then you look at the data in a non-biased way, and not a single target, not a single pathway, because the longevity is a complex process. So with the integration of the AI, the data mining, the big data, I think we will be able to find where to target, not just a single pathway, but network pathway. And then coming back to really do the trial, we all have to deal with the regulatory agency. And we've been interacting with the US FDA and the China FDA and all this regulatory agency. Also, in order to move this or to have a breakthrough, you need to see them to change as well. Right now, they want a single disease. What's your primary endpoint? They want outcome. How on the earth you run an outcome trial for aging? And it's almost impossible. Right now we know the metformin 3,000 patient trial lasts for 10 years. Which investor would fund that research? I don't know, other than Gerald, who's sitting in the audience. It's very challenging, yeah.
I think that's an incredibly important point. I want to dig a little bit more into removing the history of regulatory framework in a moment. But if we think about the drugs we have today that really could be framed as longevity treatments, you mentioned one, metformin,
right.
rapamycin, right? Traditionally developed as a cancer therapeutic or immune regulatory. I would even argue the GLP-1 class of obesity medicine today.
Yeah.
These are all drugs in which in some cases we don't even understand how they work. The observation that they have certain effects was made after they were approved for a single indication. Right. And in some cases it took a very long time to understand that in a way that wasn't commercially viable initially. So talk a little bit more, beginning with you, about unpack what you sort of opened up, which is how do we begin to think about running trials, actually reducing this promise and this sort of desire we have to think about medicine for longevity into practically how do we study that?
So when the accelerated approval pathway was adopted in the US, it was essentially adopted to motivate research in HIV. So it wasn't for rare disease, it was for a large disease with a huge unmet need that was complicated, and that there was a desire to kind of motivate that research. I don't think we're there yet for aging, but I do think that, from a regulatory perspective, that's an interesting idea. If you have agents that appear to be fairly well characterized from a safety perspective, if you see a signal in a disease of aging, all right? So I think there's probably gates to this that can then sort of open into other areas. What's happening now, to your point, is that a drug goes through a long and torturous approval process for a single indication, and then off-label use starts to inform us more broadly of how it's acting more systemically in the body. And again, the aging process is interrelated, it's a multi-organ process, so it stands to reason that many of these drugs would be working in multiple ways.
Ping, how do you think about that question of looking at clinical trials for aging, which is a very different concept than the single disease approach?
Right. I think that's what the challenge you see. There are companies focused on the anti-aging drug development. They also always have to find the disease to go target, right? And that's you get the approval, you start thinking of the off-label use and make it broader. But as I said, the current regulatory framework and with the FDA, the way they're doing things, the regulator, I think they really need to be able to have some breakthrough, like the generative AI, and to really lead us there. And I think, or I hope that things will come. But right now, I think that'll be one of the major challenges for any of the company developing anti-aging drug. Maybe there's some genetic, early aging, premature aging, and can use that as a single point in trying to get a breakthrough in order to, propagate that to the others.
What do you see? I mean, you're in this space. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
You're the expert in this, right?
I think that I'm actually thinking back to the beginning of my career in industry, about a decade ago when I finished my clinical training. And we were still using animal models of disease, right? We were creating mouse models of scleroderma, of heart attack, of what have you. And all of that failed.
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. I probably kind of consistent with popular belief, mice are not men. It just took us billions of dollars to figure that out, unfortunately. And today, we really use those preclinical models, well, it's in vitro or in vivo, just to understand the biology of the compound.
Yep.
Right.
How is it metabolized? How is it cleared? What sort of cellular processes, particularly when you think about mitochondrial function, what kind of processes is it altering? What kind of blood-based readouts
Yep.
are affected that you could then take into the clinic? But in no way do most people I know don't fool themselves into thinking that if it works in an animal, it's going to work in a human. You really have to get into the human first.
So I mean, you asked about how to design clinical trials in aging. So I do think there's a concept of some regulatory flexibility that comes into this, but with AI and with with advanced computational abilities with quantum computing, we can understand these patterns long term. We're all wearing watches, we have wearables, following patients long term, doing concurrent registries. Some of this can better inform the natural history alongside a clinical intervention. And I think that we're going to need to rely more on real world data in the science of longevity for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of where I was going, is we need to take the next leap away from traditional preclinical testing into something that looks more like in silico. And that's where you can actually start to bring in human data and not just rely on animal testing, and really relegate animal testing to what it's for, which is safety.
Exactly.
Yeah, we also, right now talking to the Chinese regulatory agency, the traditional Chinese medicine, there's a lot of drug claimed to have the anti-aging effect, right? And there's a lot of 1,000 years of human data there. If we were able to really, getting that breakthrough in one of the, ICH country, maybe that will set or pave some way to see how you assess the efficacy of any particular compound or maybe a particular recipe. Right now, I think, as you said, they all have a lot of active component and substance out there claim have anti-aging, but they're dietary supplement. They're poorly regulated. You don't know it works or not. So I think that maybe in China, with this way of looking things as a holistic approach, and we are taking initiative and talking to the regulator, and hopefully, with what we are doing, we're able to convince them to take a different approach and to look at that. And I definitely will come back to report to you both.
Yeah. I think you're making a very important point, which is this balance between scientific rigor,
right,
and the need to perhaps move more quickly than some of the regulatory frameworks, not because they're burdensome, but because they're beholden to a past way of doing things that doesn't lend itself to a forward-thinking mindset, which you have to have when you're thinking about something as radical as longevity. And so specifically, I think the idea of nutritional supplements, traditional medicines, formulations are not consistent, doses are not consistent, and making sure that we are, at the end of the day, being true to our scientific and entrepreneurial roots, saying we want to study something in a rigorous way to make sure we aren't doing harm, as was mentioned in one of the prior panels, that we actually are bringing products of value to patients. In some ways, it's very similar to many other industries not within healthcare, is we want to make sure we're delivering products to customers, or to patients in this case, that we're actually delivering on the promise that we're advertising in some ways. As we think about not just the regulatory frameworks, but who are our partners, right? We're all three of us are in more of the startup space. I would consider 12 years, given the life cycle of drug development, can be decade plus, still very much in the startup space. We need partners, right? We can't do this alone, particularly in the current bear market, where biotech investment is at a nadir. We need partners. Those could be public-private partnerships. Those could be partnerships with large pharma. As you think about both companies, but also regions of the world that might be open to this novel thinking, where does your mind go, Reenie?
So for me, in the US, the way the regulatory framework is, the way the commercial framework is, you can develop drugs for diseases of aging, discrete diseases of aging, and you can try to stack that data together to understand whether you have a broader effect on the process of aging. I do think ideally we would get to earlier intervention when we can actually save healthcare systems more money, prolong health span. I think for that it's probably a public-private partnership. I mean, I do see the potential for looking at drugs that have, you mentioned metformin, rapamycin. There are others that have well-established safety profiles. we can do clinical trials in patients and really understand side by side with concurrent registries and real world data whether those are impacting the aging process in a way that isn't necessarily driving towards commercial success. Because if you're going towards a commercial product in the current environment, you need to have a single endpoint that's going to be applicable to all patients in the trial, and again, that drives you towards the narrower disease space. So I do think public-private partnerships in regions where there's an interest in this, or with not-for-profit institutions that are dedicated to this mission of extending health span, that is what it's going to take to really move to the next, to move away from your mice and into people, to understand the science of aging.
Yeah, it's interesting. My CFO and I were in a friend's house last night, and a local friend, and I heard a very interesting business model. Maybe we all can learn about it. They have a clinic, a private clinic, where they have people subscribe the membership, and then they follow these people. They provide this nutrition support and the biomarker clinical, and then along the way, they monitor your health and provide you a report. And the plan is to stay healthy and longevity forever. So I think it's a holistic approach, which is happening in this region, in this country, but not obviously, I didn't see that in US, and then neither that in China. So maybe, as you said, where you see maybe the breakthrough, maybe here, right? And if you think the religious civilization of the world started in an Arabic country, and maybe we should all have an open mind, and I found that business model quite enlightening to me.
I think that's incredibly, it's sort of an aging app store. That's incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's also a way to collect, if you can grow your customer base from effectively a wellness center, you can actually collect the kind of multi-scale data we're talking about to be able to analyze the sort of pathways of aging. Absolutely.
Exactly, and provide you cocktail. It's not a single drug, not a single agent, but it's really, a composition of the recipe, and maybe that's what the Juvenile recipe there, right?
I was going to say, I think that's the other place that AI and wearable technology can help us. It's not just the intervention; is the intervention working? Right. Again, in terms of scaling this so that it's more broadly available and more accessible. Is the drug working? Is it still worth paying for? Is an important thing for institutions and payers that are actually writing the checks to pay for these drugs.
It actually brings up a really interesting question about who owns the data, and that's not something that we've really talked about. But in the world of drug development and in the world of pharma, who owns the data is very different than in the consumer space. And in the consumer space, being able to have access to that data, it's personally, it's protected. Really the best consumer health apps contain that data only accessible and private to the individual. Whereas healthcare systems, sort of data fluidity and data moving across borders is much more difficult. In some ways, what you're talking about is democratizing that and really having the individual own all of their data.
Right.
I've seen it in the rare disease space where people are trying to do that because, literally, patients with rare mitochondrial diseases, I think of that as early aging. So they're going to 10, 12, 15 different specialists for each of their problems because it's multi-systemic. And really marrying that data together is very challenging. So I have seen companies trying to launch essentially apps where patients can select to share their electronic medical records more broadly and pool them. And that could aid significantly in research. So I agree with you. I think that in the context of longevity, that also makes a lot of sense.
And different countries handle this differently, and some of it depends on the health system itself. Is it a more private health system? Is it a more public health system? How do you think about if we want to move to this area where the data is compilable, right? AI is only as good as the data it can analyze. It seems like we're all in agreement that some of these very complex networks of biology that we need to uncover to better understand aging are going to require AI systems. But those AI systems have to have access to the richest data set possible. How do you think about creating those rich data sets for future research?
That's going to be very challenging, And in China, the data is heavily regulated, and our data need to be, in order to share the data, this is regulation you have to go through in order to be able to do it. And I think the U.S. are trying to do the democratization of the data. I think that will be the future to go. But right now, if you notice that all the big, tech company like Google, Amazon, they start getting into the healthcare system. Maybe the way they have weather through all the maze how to do it, because you see all those big tech company, they were able to amass a huge amount of data as of today, and that's maybe where we're going to see the future holds.
Yeah, in the last 2 minutes or so, let's bring it back here. We're sitting here at FI7. There's clearly one of the most vibrant areas of the world in terms of ingenuity and interest in learning from the world, how the world has moved innovation forward. How would you think about, if you were interacting with the region here and helping think about how to set up systems that aren't beholden to some of the barriers that we talk about, what thoughts come to your mind as you think about the region here and building these systems from the ground up?
So I do think on the longevity front that some type of, you can call it a moonshot, you can think about the accelerated approval process, would open up the ability to move more rapidly into human clinical trials, again, assuming that animal models aren't really predictive, more rapidly alongside long-term registries of some nature. But I think the other thing about this region, quite frankly, is that we were meeting with a local doctor a couple of days ago, it's very rich from a genetic perspective. So I also think there are tremendous learnings that can come from this region to inform drug development. Really just doing clinical research here, I think would be very informative and interesting.
Liping, how do you think about the region?
Yeah, the way as an entrepreneur, for the past decade, the way I look at it, if you see the future, there's a future. If you see there are opportunity, there are opportunities. And I think the metabolic disease, the diabetes, the fatty liver, or obesity are a huge problem in this area. And we're actively engaging in activity to start our clinical trial program here, even build a joint venture with the partner here. So.
Yeah. Now, I think you've touched on genetic diseases quite a bit. I think there is quite a population here that could be engaged to really drive this field forward. So I see we're out of time. Reenie, Liping, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I hope this was informative to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.